All right. Well, welcome everybody. We are doing an author meets critics here on Carlos Alberto Sanchez's new book, A Sense of Brutality, Philosophy After Narco-Culture. And the way we're going to run this is we're going to have Carlos kind of introduce the project for about 10, 15 minutes. And then he's going to get, I call them comments, but they're going to be, nice, solid criticisms for about 15, 20 minutes. And then we're going to take about a 5-minute break, stretch our legs, and then Carlos will try to come back and respond. And then my hope is to have a Q&A and get folks involved. If you don't know Carlos Alberto Sanchez, he is a professor of philosophy at San José State University, where he teaches and writes on a variety of things, but has really specialized in Mexican philosophy and Mexican culture. In addition to having this, he has a wide assortment of academic journal articles, so I'm not going to list them all. But I did want to emphasize that he's got a lot of pieces for a general audience, publishing in, among other places, the RPA Magazine, the Denver Post, the San Francisco Chronicle, the Philosopher's Magazine, and the Conversation. And you've got more books than I can keep up with. The Suspension of Seriousness, I think, is one of one of the best books in Mexican phenomenology, looking at the work of Jorge Portilla. Contingency and Commitment, going right from phenomenology to Mexican existentialism. Co-edited, was an editor and translator for a very important volume on Mexican philosophy, where you and Robert Sanchez translated a lot of essential readings back in 2017 for us that we can now use when we teach our Latin American and Mexican philosophy class. So thank you so much for that. And this year doubled up. Not only did you have this book, but you've got the Disintegration of Community on Jorge Portilla's social and political thought, co-authored with Francisco Gallegos. And if that wasn't enough, you're going to pump out another book at the end of this year, it seems like, Emilio Uranga's Analysis of Mexican Being. So you're a busy guy. So
yeah, that came out. That came out yesterday, so it's good.
Such a show off. Such a show off. Okay, all right. So I'm lazy. But maybe tell us a little bit about brutality, please, sir. Thank you for joining us. And I want to actually let me thank our sponsors, which is the University of Washington Philosophy Department, the University of Washington Program on Ethics, and if you like what you hear, the Radical Philosophy Review is going to publish the final versions of the comments in Carlos's response. So, and that'll come out in the fall. So keep an eye out for that as well. Now I will really pass it on to you. Professor Sanchez, take it away.
Thank you, Jose, and thanks to the Department of Philosophy at the University of Washington for this invitation. It's really an honor to talk about this book here. So what I'm going to do is that I'm just going to give a very brief overview of the book, kind of emphasizing the themes that I'm trying to touch on, and then really kind of get into some meat of the matter once I get to the responses. So let me get to that then. Contemporary popular culture is riddled with references to Mexican drug cartels, to so-called narcos, and to drug trafficking. In the United States, filmmakers, journalists, academics, and politicians have taken note of the increasing threats to our security coming from a subculture that appears to feed on murder and brutality, contextualized within a romantic vision of power and capital. In this book, I use Mexican narco-culture as a point of departure for thinking about the meaning of violence, culture, and personhood. I argue that violent cultural modalities, of which narco-culture is but one of many, call into question what we understand by violence. The reality of narco-violence suggests that the concept of violence is incapable of capturing a reality that is at once dehumanizing and unspeakable. I propose brutality, which refers to a hyperviolence which is both excessive, objectifying, and which paradoxically evades representation. It hides. In this way, brutality is defined as more than violence, other to cruelty, and distinct from horror and terror. All concepts that are normally used interchangeably with brutality, but which, as the analysis aims to show, ought not to be. The excessive violence of narco-culture shows, moreover, that brutality can be normalized into everyday life, making possible the absolute erasure or derealization of persons. Throughout, an attempt is made to think about extreme situated violence as opposed to abstract conceptual violence. In particular, I seek to draw attention to the kind of violence that provokes silence and detachment, a violence that demands objectification and dehumanization, a violence that in its ubiquity and everydayness appears as ontological in a way of life, a violence that in its excess overflows its own concept and thus requires a new name. While the brutality that I discuss here is circumscribed to a specific space and time, that is the space and time of narco-culture, it sets itself as a condition of human life and death in many other contexts, but always with the same formative and deformative effects. In other words, contexts of brutality are determining and determined. Mexican narco-culture is one such context, and its proximity to the United States should offend our political and moral sensibilities more than they currently do, or more than it currently does. This book is an effort at awakening our philosophical sensibilities to those aspects of its profile that make it philosophically offensive, namely the excessiveness of its violence and the realization of its persons. The Washington Post, in an editorial aside, called the rising dead of narco-culture, quote, a crisis of civilization. This book is about this crisis and about the philosophical intuitions that it awakens. I subtitled the book After Narco-Culture because we are thinking in the shadow of the crisis. This is not to say that the event has passed, that the death and brutality of narco-culture is an event of history, but only that what follows here are reflections on that event, if by reflection we mean a withdrawal away from immediacy. The violence of narco-culture has not only not passed, but remains in the fullness of its barbarity and brutality as we speak. By way of summary, I will touch upon 4 themes or concepts that I treat in the book. The first is culture, the second is violence, and the third is brutality, and the fourth is personhood. In each case, my point is to think through the meaning of the concept or theme. In other words, the point is not to dwell in the empirical reality of narco-culture, but rather to think about what it means and how it challenges meaning. Thus, I ask, how does narco-culture challenge our understanding of culture itself? What does violence mean, and can that meaning properly capture the reality of narco-violence as is illustrated here, although in profile? How is the concept violence insufficient? And if not violence, then what? Perhaps brutality. And finally, how does the brutality of narco-culture, at its most extreme and dehumanizing, challenge the very concept of personhood as we understand it? So culture. What we mean by culture is hard to pin down. Refer to it as something that we have, or as some force that unites us, that defines us and lends us an orientation. Matthew Arnold says that it is what perfects us. Forced to point it out, we point instead to artistic production, societal customs, and other ethical, political, or economic characteristics that defined our culture. So although we don't really know what it is, we still talk about it confidently and even talk about sub or countercultures. That is marginal cultures to this, the one and true culture. When we look at narco-culture as with other so-called sub or countercultures, we find that we can only point at it by picking out similar aesthetic, economic, or political characteristics or arrangements that give it a cultural feel. What's not clear, however, is what exactly makes it a sub or counterculture. Is there a homogeneous culture of which this is an offshoot, a splinter, or a member? I don't think there's a homogeneous, homogenizing culture of which other cultures are mere splinters. The key insight here is that there is no phenomenological evidence for that one overriding culture that has other cultures as members or as internally against it. What we have is different cultures with different values, making possible different ways of life. Thus, judging from the music, art, economics, and values that emerge from the way of life made possible by narcotics trafficking, it is clear that narco-culture is culture. Ultimately, my claim is that narco-culture stands out from the others in that one of its core values is violence, or as I say later, brutality. What I say is this in the book. I say, narco-culture as culture extends itself outward via its violent imperatives, its rules, its music, its art, and its literature, as well as other forms of media spectacle and most importantly, intersubjective relations, so that one can be a member of the narco form of life without having to have made a choice about it. The choice to do so is not a prerequisite for membership. We can say that one is thrown into narco-culture or that it is thrown onto one. Which brings me to violence. A cursory glance at events taking place in Mexico's so-called drug wars makes it evident that violence is rampant and every day, that Mexico is in crisis. Digging a little deeper into the headlines coming out of Mexico, one immediately notices that the violence is gruesome, at times unimaginable, at times unspeakable, and one says to oneself, barbaric. From reports of children, pregnant women, journalists, and narcos themselves, being burned to death, decapitated, chopped to pieces, disappeared, etc., one can only murmur to oneself that this is something else. The intuition that this is something else means, as far as I'm concerned, that what we witness here is something more than what we understand by mere violence. This is more than violence. In chapter 2, I spent some time thinking about how Western philosophy has understood violence. I think about Sorel and Fanon and Sartre's interpretation of Fanon, Fanon's understanding of violence as recreating subjects. My claim here is that the violence of narco-culture is not creative or recreative in the ways in which Sartre imagines that it can be. The violence of narco-culture, in being more than violence, is absolutely destructive and derealizing. But if it is not violence, then what is it? Well, I call it brutality. I define brutality in several ways, but the main idea is that brutality is an excess or a surplus of violence. What this means is that while the murder of a man in his home is already an act, it's already a violent act, the execution of the rest of his family, for no other reason than to punish the already murdered man, is more than and other to violence. These are extra happenings that urge our rational consciousness to ask paradoxical questions about the limits of violence or the acceptability of death. The surplus is expressed in those adjectives added to violence, such as unthinkable, irrepressible, unnecessary, or unspeakable. Again, the concept of violence simply does not capture the fullness and reality of this surplus. It is a surplus of violence that is simultaneously other than violence and beyond it. Brutality, I argue, has its own logic, which I call the negative logic of brutality. This is a logic of denial and seeks to convince those within a particular cultural context or life community that their everyday experience of excessive violence is normal. Here we arrive at a crucial point. Cultural modalities exist in which the objectification of others has become routine, where the suffering and the brutality that destroy persons are accepted as mundane. The normalization of brutality thus initiates the process of transforming persons into killable bodies, a reification in which one cannot be brutal because persons are not persons, but things. Normalized in this way, brutality seems to gradually disappear or recede into what is accepted. And finally, I consider personhood. My claim here is that contexts of brutality, like narco-culture, challenge our concepts of the person. In accordance with brutality's logic, one cannot be brutal towards objects. One can be brutal towards persons. However, when objectification becomes routine, persons become objects, and because one cannot be brutal towards objects, brutality itself recedes into the background. Or said in a different way, brutality fades into the noise of everyday being. This receding or fading, however, is not a disappearing per se, but a normalization. The result is that in turning persons into objects, certain contexts make it normal to be brutal to persons, without it seeming as if it is in reality persons who are being brutalized. I call this the brutality paradox. I use the example of turning individuals into pozole, into soup, as the most extreme manifestation of this paradox. And there you have the kind of a very general summary of the book and everything that goes into it. Of course, there's some details there that I didn't include in the summary, but hopefully they'll come out in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, this is great. Let me give you a reaction here. I'm slow. Oh, you can't even see my brown hand by my books, but it's there. Let's look at, so now we got some comments coming your way. We're gonna start with Sergio Gallegos, who's an assistant professor of philosophy at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice. He's currently working on actually a lot of projects at the intersection of Latin American philosophy, feminist philosophy, philosophy of race, pragmatism, philosophy of science, and social epistemology. But what I think is some of the most interesting stuff you're doing, Sergio, is your work on Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. This is what in Latin American philosophy we would call a colonial philosopher, although she's kind of a proto-modern, and not a lot of work gets done on her, and she's kind of overlooked because of the fact that she was writing as a nun, so wasn't quite in an academic setting, but she had some excellent critiques about the philosophy being done at the time, and some insights that I think can translate. And you've got a ton of in progress, forthcoming stuff. I think one of your articles is already out too. But it's great work, and I thank you for it, and my students will be thanking you for it as well. So welcome, and I'm looking forward to hear your comment. We all are.
Thank you so much, Jose. Thank you so much to Carlos for the opportunity to comment on basically a great piece of work, which is extremely timely and which really pushes us to basically reflect on what I agree is basically a crisis of civilization. So my comments basically are the following. I mean, I'm in overall agreement with basically a lot of the claims that Carlos makes in the book. In particular, I think that the work that he performs really forces us to rethink, as basically Anna Arendt did in Ackman in Jerusalem, which is, I think, and please do correct me if I'm wrong, Carlos, part of the inspiration that basically draw you to basically write your book. So Carlos's book forces us, like Hannah Arendt's book did, to rethink basically about how we use certain concepts. And in particular, Carlos's work really forces us to rethink the concepts of culture, the concept of brutality, and the concept of personhood, which is what I'm basically going to be focusing on in my comments. So in particular, in the case of the notion of just give me a second. In the case of the notion of culture, I agree with Carlos that basically if we understand culture as an intersubjective agreement with basically its own values, rules, and projects that can not only uplift life, but also degrade life, to what extent is basically a culture that degrades life, as narco-culture is, focused exclusively or primarily on values such as efficiency? And my question arises in connection to a fragment of the encyclical Evangelium Vitae from 1985 from John Paul II, in which he basically wrote the following, and here I quote: "This reality is characterized by the emergence of a culture which denies solidarity and in many cases takes the form of a veritable culture of death. So this culture is actively fostered by powerful cultural, economic, and political currents, which encourage an idea of society excessively concerned with efficiency. A person who, because of illness, handicap, or more simply, just because of by existence, compromises the well-being or lifestyle of those who are more favored tends to be looked upon as an enemy to be resisted or eliminated," end quote. So in connection with this fragment, basically another question that I want to basically ask Carlos is the following. If it is indeed the case that life-degrading cultures, such as narco-culture is, are exclusively or primarily focused on efficiency, which is very much the case of narco-culture, given the connections with a very materialistic, capitalistic mindset that Carlos makes a very good job in laying out. So isn't it the case that Jose Vasconcelos basically had a point in his work, Bolivarismo y Monroeismo from 1934, when he basically made the point that despite their many differences, both US capitalism and Soviet communism, which are, according to me, and I agree with Vasconcelos on this issue, dehumanizing basically cultures, just as narco-culture is, were not fundamentally distinct, since they basically both focus on efficiency and thus promoted basically a culture that dehumanized people. And this is what Vasconcelos basically writes on this issue. At various times, we have remarked that the sameness of the ends of the super capitalist of the United States and the super socialist of Russia attain. Insofar as they ensconce the economic man, they both have created a man machine that leaves to work. And insofar as he works to eat, he fatally ends up fetishizing tasks and instruments, end quote. So in virtue of this, my question is whether Carlos basically thinks that there are some basically deep connections here that can be perhaps explored between narco-culture and, on the one side, US capitalism, but also Soviet communism. So this pertains basically to my remarks on the notion, on Carlos' analysis of the notion of culture. So the second set of questions that I basically want to raise to Carlos pertains to the notion of brutality, which I think is extremely important, and he offers a fascinating analysis of it. So I agree with Carlos that brutality consists, as he puts it, in an overflow or flood of violence, and that it is precisely this excessive and transgressive character of brutality that makes possible the tripartite logic of denial that he examines basically so well as the three kinds of silence that he diagnoses in basically his book. So my questions basically pertain to the circumstances in which brutality emerges, not only within narco-culture, but also in other cultures that degrade life. And here in particular, the case that I want to focus on is a case examined by the historian Timothy Snyder, who in his book Bloodlands, Europe Between Hitler and Stalin, which was published in 2012, he basically argued that the mass extermination undertaken by both Nazis and Soviets authorities, which took place from 1933 to 1945 in a region that basically goes roughly from the Black Sea to the Baltic Sea, occurred precisely in this region because both Nazis and Soviets went to great lengths to ultimately destroy states such as Poland, as well as state institutions such as basically the civil code in this particular part of the world. So, so if this is indeed the case, is brutality something that is intimately connected to statelessness, state failure, or state destruction? And if this is indeed the case, would some effective ways to basically resist brutality involve defending and propping up states or state institutions, which in spite of all their flaws and shortcomings can perhaps provide a bulwark against brutality? So that's basically my questions and remarks with respect to brutality. Finally, my last set of questions to Carlos consist in his analysis of personhood and the way in which narco-culture forces us to basically rethink what our conception of personhood. So in Carlos's view, one of the most extreme manifestations of narco-culture consists in the fact that some of its participants aim, as he puts it, to completely derealize human beings by literally liquidating or liquefying people through the narco-pozole practice that he was telling us about. This is because, and here I quote him, dissolving the corpse in vats of acid can be thought as the ultimate violation of life itself, as it points out to the impossibility of lending life that unity after death that is fundamental to our humanity, end quote. And yet, as Carlos acknowledges basically in the book, even in the case of the narco-pozolero Santiago Mesa Lopez, the effort to basically derealize his victims was never completely successful, since there are parts of the body that stubbornly resist attempts to be erased. And this is why ultimately Santiago Mesa Lopez was captured, because he couldn't completely dispose of some basically fragments of bodies. He couldn't completely eliminate them. He was forced to ultimately throw them away in the desert. And that's how ultimately they were found, retrieved, and how he was ultimately caught. So if this is indeed the case, should we view basically the stubborn resistance of our bodies to total elimination and erasure as a sign that narco-culture, despite its current power and appeal, and I completely agree with Carlos that it has a lot of power and appeal, particularly among Mexicans who often don't see other alternatives basically in their lives, can never completely triumph as a form of life, since our humanity can never completely be erased despite all of the efforts that are basically done to do so. And my second question is, are there lessons that we can basically draw from the resistance of our physical bodies to attempts to entirely derealize them in order to combat or push back the effects basically of the brutality of narco-culture, in particular, the various forms of silence that it basically produces. So these are my comments. And by the way, me encantó tu libro, carnal. It's awesome.
Great. Thank you, Sergio. Thank you very much. We'll give you a little clap here if I can figure this out. There we go. Again, you can't see it, but it's there. Okay. So let's move on to the second set of comments. Our second set of comments come from Manuela Gomez, who is a professor of philosophy at El Paso Community College. She has over 15 years of teaching experience on both sides of the US-Mexico border. She specializes in philosophy of pedagogy, ethics, feminism, and Latin American philosophy. She is the author of the book, Rediscovering the Philosophical Importance of Jose Ingenieros, A Bridge Between Two Worlds. And this work connects Latin American philosophy in very interesting ways with American pragmatism. And so this is the academic stuff, but Manuela does a lot of super interesting stuff at the border. For one thing, she's an award-winning journalist who focuses a lot on US and Mexico politics, and is also running what I think is the most exciting philosophy club in the entire nation. And it's not just my opinion. She was actually recognized, this club was recognized as this by the American Philosophical Association. She's the advisor, so I don't know, it's one or the other, but these groups of philosophy students do amazing activist work. Find them at El Paso Community College Philosophy Club and like them on Facebook and follow them because they do great and amazing stuff. With that, I pass it over to you, Mena.
Thank you so much for this invitation. The fact that we're having a space dedicated to just discussing Mexican philosophy gives me a lot of hope for the future of our field. So I want to preface my critique by congratulating Carlos for presenting us with an innovative philosophical project that expands the parameters of what philosophy is expected to do. He's familiar with some of my criticisms, so I'm going to give some of the highlights. The book, A Sense of Brutality, Philosophy After Narco-Culture, endeavors to think about brutality and narco-culture philosophically using the methodology of phenomenological existentialism. The subtitle, Philosophy After Narco-Culture, offers an interesting play on meanings and two different possibilities. The first one, as if the word after means that philosophy is chasing after narco-culture and out and seek to demand justice. The second, where the word after has a temporal meaning as philosophy that occurs not before but succeeding narco-culture. Although the first possibility sounds exciting, Sanchez sets out to direct his unique analysis after the political and social effects of 2006, when the then president of Mexico, Felipe Calderón, declared the war on drugs and narco trafficking, detonating extreme brutality and hundreds of thousands of deaths in Mexico. Sanchez argues that his exploration is similar to French philosophers who philosophized after Auschwitz and American philosophers who philosophized after 9/11. The difference here is that for most people in and around Mexico, the effects of narco violence have not passed. They are still here, more present than ever. We cannot speak of these phenomena as concluded in the past tense when they continue to manifest and transform daily. A more fitting description instead of philosophy after a narco-culture perhaps would be to say that this is philosophy during narco-violence. Nonetheless, in this study, Sanchez offers a series of fascinating and very relevant philosophical reflections after he looks at specific narco-culture examples, mainly from news, articles, books, and narco-corridos, as he attempts to extract their meaning and essence. The cover of the paperback edition of the book is black with white and red text surrounding an image of 3 bullet holes that aesthetically manifest a dark and serious tone. Although not all narco violence is always visible, the 3 gunshots symbolize to the reader some of the physical damage that is sometimes left behind. The book is comprised of 4 chapters that range from legitimizing and understanding narco-culture as a standalone culture to an analysis on personhood. Despite the everyday normalization of death and suffering that most Mexican people have grown accustomed to, these chapters weave an argument of urgency in addressing this humanitarian disaster. In the first pages, as Sanchez describes some disturbing cases of narco-violence like decapitated corpses and bodies found in car trunks to illustrate the extreme brutality that he seeks to analyze, Sanchez states, quote, "Although these scenes unfold in places and contexts that are usually unfamiliar to us, we are all witnesses," end of quote. Here, Sanchez defines his positionality as someone removed from the context of narco-violence and his audience as those who are detached and foreign to the gruesome reality of it. His audience seem to be interested Americans from the outside looking in. An example of this is in the initial chapter on culture and narco-culture that starts with the lyrics of Mis Tres Animales, a popular Mexican song by Los Tucanes de Tijuana that glorifies the narco way of life. The lyrics are presented in English when the song is originally in Spanish. Los tres animales are perico, gallo, y chiva. They are metaphorical slang references to drugs, and although Sanchez explains that they mean cocaine, marijuana, and heroin, some of the original connotation is semantically lost when the words are presented in English. In future chapters, the lyrics are presented in both languages. When talking about narco-culture, we are simultaneously exploring a culture of creation and destruction. It is a culture that produces fashion and music, and one that annihilates whatever is in its way. Therefore, we must talk of two or more sides and stay away from homogeneous explanations. Dualism is necessary since there is no single territory more saturated with narco-violence than the US-Mexico borders. But Sanchez presents Mexico as one monolithic space that suffers equally. There is no specific distinction or analysis offered for border places like my hometown of Ciudad Juárez, Chihuahua, at one point considered the most dangerous city in the world and the main battleground for the Mexican war on drugs, even before the political effects of 2006. Ironically, it's located next to its sister city of El Paso, Texas, considered one of the safest cities in the United States. Sanchez dismisses the unique paradoxical geographical, transnational, and transcultural phenomena of Mexican borders in relation to narco-culture and brutality. Consequently, there's no mention of philosophical figures like Gloria and Saldúa who could offer special insight into the complex hybrid dimensions of the in-betweenness of the border. Sanchez utilizes mostly quotes and analyses from Aristotle, Jaspers, Hegel, Levinas, Zizek, Foucault, and Sartre. And while he does quote Paz and Caso, he leaves one wondering why not focus more on Mexican or Latin American philosophers. Sanchez lacks more than a dedicated examination of the phenomenon of narco-violence and its exclusive consequences in the border. He also disregards its ramifications into the American immigration crisis, the maquiladora factory hyper-exploitation of workers, and the infinite number of human rights violations against people crossing the border every day because they're suspected of being narcos. Not to mention the thousands of missing girls and women who have been raped and killed in all of Mexico, but mostly in Juárez, and whose disappearances and over 60% of deaths have been attributed to organized crime. Overall, Sanchez neglects the gendered consequences of narco-culture and their direct correlation to violence against women. As much as he dissects narco-corridos, claiming they're the most direct source of information, he ignores how the lyrics celebrate and promote misogyny. Additionally, paternalism and machismo are briefly mentioned in one sentence when analyzing Mexican indifference to death, and Simone de Beauvoir and Judith Butler are cited only in relation to the analytical conception of violence. But I claim these are missed opportunities to expand on gender-based crime directed at women and the overall feminist implications of narco-culture and narco-violence. In many instances, they are one and the same, but Sanchez's boundaries are rigid. He claims narco-culture refers to the cultural complex created by and surrounding those in the narcotics trafficking business. Nevertheless, Sanchez overlooks how narco-culture infiltrates all aspects of social life, and it involves mothers, wives, lawyers, priests, judges, politicians, and very often the same government that is supposedly fighting against it. Furthermore, he does not address the complex multidimensional layers of narco-violence like extortions, kidnappings, sex trafficking, child pornography, and corruption. These are not separate phenomena. All of these injustices are intertwined. Sanchez seems to focus on the brutality against bodies and continuously mentions decapitations, but does not take into account the brutality of mind and spirit. There is brutality that cannot be quantified. And in his example, Sanchez focuses mostly on aggressions among sicarios who torture and who gun down others and whose bodies can be counted. But there's no elaboration on the psychological effects like the collective trauma that lingers. It is important to note that narco-violence is not made up of a clear designated group of narcos killing each other. In addition, Sanchez claims that narco-culture forces us to reconsider the notion of culture itself and persistently defends narco-culture as culture pure and simple and not as a subculture, because labeling it as a subculture would mean there is a single absolutist Mexican culture. Yet he makes those same uniform claims about narco-culture as a whole, as he offers no distinction between cartels. In fact, they're all treated as one universal group and as if they all operated under the same rites and rituals. He does not make distinctions between Mexican cartels like Los Zetas, El Cártel de Sinaloa, El Cártel de Jalisco Nueva Generación, El Cártel de Tijuana, El Cártel del Golfo, El Cártel de Juárez, etc. While all of them are deadly, they are different. It is easy to perceive Mexico as a failed state from this book. And even though Sanchez recognizes that narco-violence is a global problem, he does not explore the imperial role of the United States, a country just as responsible as Mexico for the brutality and even more complicit in the horror that has destroyed so many lives. Any blame for the United States is disguised into it being part of the residue of modern neoliberal free market capitalism. Accountability is treated as an inescapable economic fault. Existentially, this is problematic because Sanchez controversially claims that narcos do not choose, since the choice to live in this form of life is a false choice. This notion of determinism is dismissive to the efforts of the thousands of men and women who rise above their difficult circumstances of extreme poverty and seek an education. It is disrespectful to those who work every day and aim to become good members of their society. Many of them even overcome their bleak socioeconomic limitations to work precisely against narco-violence, like journalists from humble upbringings who risk their lives to expose the truth. In 2020, Mexico was considered the deadliest country for journalists. It has been that way for a long time. Narco-violence has directly affected many, including myself. I share these reflections not just as a philosopher or as a journalist who has studied these phenomena, but as someone who has lived and survived narco-violence. My mother, journalist Linda Bejarano, was murdered when she was 6 months pregnant by a Mexican drug cartel in 1988. My grandmother and my father's best friend were also killed in the attack. Therefore, I have personal reasons to disagree with Sanchez and his notion of choice. Individuals are not condemned to be puppets of drug trade. While I recognize that the escape is narrow and the limitation of socioeconomic forces are real, people have some agency. Denying this would imply that no one should be held responsible for cartel violence. If, as Sanchez suggests, some are condemned to be narcos because they face starvation or immigration, and everything is a fatalistic effect of the machine that is hypercapitalism, it would mean that all who are in precarious conditions are condemned to be narcos. Inevitably, we must then ask the question, well, who is to blame? Sanchez's answer is elusive. We get some hints here and there. He argues that brutality is a function of our global culture and the economic and political scaffolding supporting most contemporary neoliberal states. But ultimately, el narco, as it is commonly referred to in Mexico, despite being present everywhere, remains as a ghostly force that is rarely embodied as flesh and blood. To prove the horrific aftermath of narco violence that has claimed more than 250,000 lives, Sanchez highlights news headlines from the Washington Post, CNN, and Fox News. But Sanchez would benefit from tapping into the power of the lived experience and the impact of testimonios. First-hand accounts from victims of narco violence or even direct interviews with narcos themselves would give a deeper glimpse into their brutal realities. Another limitation of Sanchez's analysis is that he generalizes who the victims of narco violence are. He states that there is an overall lack of moral outrage because the victims are, quote, criminals, immigrants, jihadists, drug dealers, terrorists, kidnappers, Mexicans, Africans, narcos, end of quote. This is false. He forgets the thousands of victims of El Narco that were model citizens or unsuspecting innocent bystanders that never participated in illegal behavior. The victims of organized crime are like individuals like 52-year-old Marisela Escobedo, a social justice activist who investigated the killing of her 16-year-old daughter, Ruby, in 2008. When Marisela uncovered and publicly denounced the connection between El Narco, Mexican authorities, and femicides, she was shot dead in front of the government palace in Chihuahua in 2010. The victims are like 27-year-old Juarez artist and feminist activist Isabel Cabanilla de la Torre, who was shot dead in 2020 as she cycled home. The victims are like 7-year-old Fatima Cecilia, raped and killed, also in 2020 in Tláhuac, and found in a trash bag, and whose death fueled the movement and protest of hundreds of thousands of women in Mexico, united by the chant, Ni una más, not one more, proving that there are witnesses to these tragedies and demonstrating that there is indeed moral outrage along with moral fatigue. There are those that would dare claim these crimes are outside of the scope of El Narco, but they're not. They're profoundly rooted as one. Sanchez argues that the role of philosophy is to appear in conditions of terror as a breakthrough that allows us to see the violence in its uniqueness as a situational crisis that should be articulated so that it may be understood. He argues this book is a much needed philosophical intervention and claims that the enormous task is for, quote, American philosophy, end of quote, intentionally in quotation marks, but not explained as to why. This is an essential consideration. As philosophers, we need to define who gets to analyze Mexican culture and on what grounds, even more so when there is a need for an intervention. We need to defend Mexican philosophy and the importance of the positionality of philosophizing as a Mexican, not just be content with philosophy about Mexicans. Sanchez puts forward his own conceptual intervention that is mostly descriptive and that focuses on the existential complexity of narco-culture, but leaves one wanting more clues for normative prescriptions that would serve as potential solutions for the moral challenges and their brutal effects. His conceptual analysis on culture and violence and his suggestions imply that the concepts of terror and cruelty are insufficient terms. He argues that we should call hyperviolence brutality, and that brutality is the surplus of violence that transgresses the limits of violence. But there are some dangers and limitations to conceptual interventions. One question to consider is, how will replacing a word over another going to solve this crisis of civilization? How is a conceptual intervention that asks us to use the word brutality instead of violence different than arguing that el narco is better called organized crime, mafia, mob, drug lords, or sicarios? Sanchez's work comes full circle as he presents an interesting dichotomy that is conflicting yet captivating. On one extreme, he begins his introduction by claiming that narco-culture recognizes and celebrates narcos' lives. He gives the example of the narco necropolis Jardín de Umayá, a cemetery in Culiacán, Sinaloa, famous for its opulent displays of posthumous rendition to narcos. This luxurious place is mentioned in many narco corridos because it preserves the memories of many narcos considered idols. And then on the other hand, towards the end of this book, he argues that narcos' lives are so disposable that their bodies are made into pozole, liquefied into barrels of diesel to make them disappear, and as a complete erasure of who they are. So we have narcos being presented as both cultural heroes and as leftover humans too. And this is because understanding narco-culture and narco-violence is an intricate task. It is bipolar, extreme, and contradictory, hence why congruency is so easy to criticize. Yet, despite my very explicit criticism, I am convinced that this is a crucial philosophical project, one that highlights the importance of Mexican philosophy, and I'm excited for the moral and practical implications that follow from Sanchez's descriptive work. Sanchez bravely shows us that we need field philosophy to look at the world around us, and that we should analyze specific sociopolitical phenomena to make radical recommendations. Overall, this book is a great and much needed start towards that direction, as Sanchez successfully paves the way for a new type of philosophical inquiry.
Thank you so much. That was great. Oh man, with that was fire. We're gonna have to take a few minutes, folks. Stretch our legs. What time is it here? So let's say I'm gonna say 4:22. Mexican time is 4:23. Okay, but like 4:22, aim for 4:22. Okay, is that right? We got 5 minutes. 4:22. All right. Está Goyito. Goyito is here. See him in the chat.
Is he gone or is he still?
Órale, órale,
Órale.
Sorry, I don't have a video, but
Goyo, this is impressive, man. I didn't even know you had electricity. You were like Batista in bed.
I called the governor to just provide electricity to see this.
Oh man. Okay, I'll be right back.
I got him in advance, so I was able to kind of sit with him for a while and kind of really go through them. So let me get to that. I'll be reading from my computer here, so I won't be seeing your faces react to anything. All right, so here's my response. Sergio Gallegos and Manuela Gomez approached their readings in strikingly different ways. I'll begin with Sergio's critique, which is directed less to what the book does not say, as is Gomez's, and more to interrogating what it does say. Before getting to my responses, two of Gallegos' comments. I'm sorry, no, I'm gonna skip that. I had this. I was gonna point out these two comments that I thought kind of really captured the essence of the book, but I'm gonna skip that. Okay, so there are three main lines of inquiry in Gallegos' reading of A Sense of Brutality, or three questions. The first deals with what I mean by a culture of efficiency when talking about narco-culture. He asked, quote, to what extent this culture that degrades life focus exclusively or primarily on values such as efficiency, and goes on to quote John Paul II on that very topic. Pope John Paul II encyclical complements and completes my thought that efficiency is certainly a value of narco-culture, because I think that the economic substratum of the culture is essential to its very existence, so that what is desired is speed and ease in product transport and sale, so as to make as much money as possible in the shortest amount of time and ready to beat the competition. I also think that it is imperative for that culture that whatever goes against the value of efficiency must be resisted or eliminated. Moreover, I think that this is a quality not only of narco-culture, but of modernity itself. Narco-culture is in this way a creation of a monstrous economic imperative endemic to our historical time, but one which takes it to its excess and its extreme. This ties with a point Gallegos makes of Vasconcelos' insights into Russia and the US. Quote, insofar as they ensconce the economic man, they both have created a man machine that lives to work. And insofar as he works to eat, he fatally ends up fetishizing tasks and instruments, unquote. These thoughts, which are external to my study, justify my intuitions about the capacity of cultures to fully determine individual choice and consequently individual action. If efficiency, brutality, and death are pervasive aspects of the culture in which I live, then how does this affect the choices of life that I have? How do my circumstances, which are horizons of possible life, dictate my options and thus my response to those options? I think they determine me, and I'll return to this below. The second set of questions deals with brutality in particular. He asked, my questions pertain to the circumstances in which brutality emerges, not only within the narco-culture, but in other cultures that degrade life. What goes on to quote Timothy Snyder, or to talk about Timothy Snyder, who argued that the mass extermination undertaken by both the Nazis and Soviet authorities occurred precisely in the region because both Nazis and Soviets went to great length to destroy states as well as state institutions. And his question is brutality intimately connected to statelessness, state failure, or state destruction? Would some effective ways to resist brutality involve defending and propping up states and state institutions? This is an interesting question that picks out the role of the state in the propagation of brutality. In narco-culture, the question is related to the notion of a narco-state, a state that the institutions of which have been infiltrated by narcos, narco-money, the narco-business, or narco-practices. In Mexico, this is a persistent worry as narco-influence and brutality more and more invade the government at the highest levels. In January of this year, in 2021, 19 bodies were found murdered, burned, and charred inside 4 trucks in the state of Tamaulipas. Most of these were later identified as Guatemalan immigrants. The trucks were later identified as belonging to the government. A regional cartel was initially blamed. It was later revealed that those responsible for the massacre were part of a migrant smuggling ring comprised of narcos and state police. 12 members of the state police have been arrested, some of them US trained and vetted, a fact that points straight to the state governor's office. The question is whether or not brutality is connected to state failure, and I think that as soon as the practices of brutality are deployed for the sake of state interests, then the state as a state has failed. But I also think that propping up states and state institutions will do much to keep brutality. I also don't think that propping up states will do much to keep brutality at bay, especially when brutality becomes a form of life or as a consequence of something much more powerful or bigger than the state. The final set of questions have to do with personhood and with the inability to fully derealize persons. Gallegos asked, even in the case of the narco-postulero Santiago Mesa Lopez, the effort to derealize his victims was never completely successful, and there are parts of the human body that stubbornly resist attempts to be erased. If this is indeed the case, should we view the stubborn resistance of our bodies to total elimination and erasure as a sign that narco-culture despite its current power and appeal, can never completely triumph as a form of life, since our humanity can never be completely undone. It is clear the families of the victims themselves will not allow the full derealization of their loved ones. Memory preserves the reality of persons in many ways. The knowledge that without bodies there is no justice motivates mothers to continue looking for their sons and daughters years after their disappearance, recognizing that when they find them, they may find only traces. That these traces, bone fragments, clothing, jewelry, are often enough to counteract the erasure of personhood to which acts like pozole aim. Now, is this resistance enough to say that narco-culture is defeated? No. It only means that the intentionality of brutality itself cannot be fulfilled. Brutality and not narco-culture as culture finds its limits in the persistence of memory and the human body itself. I don't say enough about this in this book, but it's certainly significant that the most brutal practices find their limit in the very objects which they seek to brutalize. Manuela Gomez's critique is much more involved with the silences of the book itself. Her criticisms are many, and she begins at the beginning with a cover of the book, moving on to the title, or rather with a subtitle. She writes, the subtitle, Philosophy After Narco-Culture, offers an interesting play on meanings and two different possibilities. The first one, as if the word after means that philosophy is chasing after narco-culture to demand justice. The second word, after, has a temporal meaning as philosophy that occurs not before but succeeding narco-culture. Although the first possibility sounds exciting, Sanchez sets out to direct this unique analysis after the political and social effects of 2006. Although this criticism is minor, or the observation is minor, I believe that it is relevant to the project and so it's worth addressing. The after in the subtitle refers to neither of these, and it particularly does not refer to the first, since at no point do I demand justice. As I emphasized in the introduction, this is a phenomenological descriptive project, and any normative claims that I make emerge from those descriptions and are meant to be seen as, descriptions and are not meant to be seen as a demand for justice. The after refers rather to reflections on witnessing the humanitarian crisis, which seems to have no end. The temporality of the after refers to me as witness, to my act of withdrawal and reflection, and withdrawal into philosophy, with a prima facie recognition that something has gone horribly wrong. Thus, neither am I demanding justice, nor am I giving a historical account of events after 2006, since this is not a socio-political historical study. The focus on narco-culture, moreover, serves as a point of departure for a phenomenological reflection on meaning, the meaning of violence, culture, personhood. My question is, how does something like narco-culture, its violent imperatives, and the moral crises it engenders challenge the meaning of our most sacred philosophical concepts? Hence, never do I suggest that narco-violence is over or that narco-culture is in the past, either in the title or otherwise. Now to the more substantial criticisms. Gomez's objections are many, so I will only address the most challenging, and they fall into four major concerns. I will discuss them not in order of appearance, but in order of importance. The first is the most serious and philosophically complex criticism. It raises the issue of freedom and responsibility. It has two fronts. The first has to do with geopolitical responsibility, the second with personal responsibility. Regarding geopolitical responsibility, Gomez writes, quote, "It is easy to perceive Mexico as a failed state from this book. And even though Sanchez recognizes that narco-violence is a global problem, he does not explore the imperial role of the United States, a country just as responsible as Mexico for the brutality and even more complicit in the horror that has destroyed so many lives. Any blame from the United States is disguised into it being part of the residue of modern neoliberal free market capitalism. Accountability is treated as an inescapable economic fault," unquote. The idea here is that I place no blame on the US for its role in narco-violence and all the blame on Mexico and the mysteries of neoliberal capitalism. However, nor do I say that Mexico is a failed state, nor do I suggest that the US bears no responsibility. What I do say is that modern economic arrangements have made it so that narcotics trafficking has become an option for Mexican life, and that without these arrangements, narcotics trafficking and thus narco-culture would not be as deadly and dangerous as it is. These are descriptive statements. Does this mean that the US bears no responsibility? Absolutely not. But neither do I intend to suggest that it bears all the responsibility. The interesting idea, moreover, is that either everyone is responsible or no one is. If I were to place blame, I would place it on everyone. The Mexican government, neoliberalism, US drug policy, US immigration policy, the IMF, globalization, etc. Of course, saying that everyone is responsible makes it possible to suggest that no one particular person is responsible for their actions, not even the killers or rapists or cartel leaders. This is the second front of the responsibility criticism. On this, Gomez writes, quote, Sanchez controversially claims that narcos do not choose, since the choice to live in this form of life is a false choice. The notion of determinism is dismissive to the efforts of the thousands of men and women who rise above their difficult circumstance of extreme poverty and seek an education. It is disrespectful to those who work hard every day and aim to become good members of our society. Many of them even overcome their bleak socioeconomic limitations to work against narco violence, like journalists from humble upbringings who risk their lives to expose the truth. Later, this criticism takes on a more personal tone when Gomez writes, quote, narco violence has directly affected many, including myself. I share these reflections not just as a philosopher or as a journalist who has studied this phenomenon, but as someone who has lived and survived narco violence. My mother, journalist Linda Bejarano, was killed when she was 6 months pregnant by a Mexican drug cartel in 1998. My grandmother and my father's best friend were also murdered in the attack. Therefore, I have personal reasons to disagree with Sanchez and his notion of choice. Individuals are not condemned to be puppets of drug trade. While I recognize that the escape is narrow and the limitations of socioeconomic forces are real, people have some agency. Denying this would imply that no one should be held responsible for cartel violence, unquote. There's two criticisms in this second front. One, that what I say implies that narcos are not responsible for their actions, and two, that I am disrespecting those people who choose to work against narco violence. Regarding the first, my stance is that we are determined by our circumstances, that our circumstances determine our choices, and that our choices are limited to what the circumstances allow. Moreover, that the circumstance may be such that the choices available to me may be morally problematic, so that my actions turn out to be problematic as well. This self-contained system of opportunities for moral action, which Manuel Vargas, who's right here in the audience, calls a moral ecology, means that I am not free to do and to be what others in other moral ecologies may be free to do and be. This would be an impoverished moral ecology, one where opportunities to be something other than one is told one can be, are not available. Regardless of its status as culture, of its cultural production, narco-culture is an impoverished moral ecology. Agents in this culture may have the option to either take part in it in various ways, avoid it completely by doing something else while still stay vigilant to its influences, or resisting it altogether. But then these are the choices. Those individuals that end up working for the cartels are determined to do so, just as those that choose to work against the cartels, or those who refuse it entirely. Does this mean that narcos are not responsible for their actions? That they are all puppets? Does this mean that there is no moral culpability? As unsatisfactory as this may seem, my claim is that agents in brutal moral ecologies are not responsible for their brutal ways in the significant sense that their actions were completely free and freely chosen. That is, they are not responsible in the important sense that as fully rational actors, they were free of the coercion inherent in an impoverished moral ecology. Sure, we can hold individuals responsible in courts of law. We can name them and their crimes, put them in front of cameras and sentence them to prison, and we can exact a fair measure of retribution. But the reason for their actions remains as if outside of them, in the environment, in the circumstance, in the micro-ecology of narco-culture, and in the macro-ecology of globalization. Regarding the second criticism, that I am not accounting for, and that in fact I am disrespecting the work of those who choose to fight against the violence and brutality, who by choosing to do this kind of work show that they are not determined in the way that I suggest. I will only repeat that choosing to fight against narco violence is a choice that was determined by the same moral ecology that forced others to participate in the brutality. Free will and freedom of choice are limited to the imagination of the agents determined to exist within a particular context. That one has a choice to either remain silent, speak out, or involve oneself in the narco game means only that there are not a lot of options to choose from. To suggest, however, that I am being disrespectful is to misread the work, and I am unclear as to what my analyses have to do with respect. It is a misreading because mine is not a comprehensive sociological typography of the different kinds of violence and the different sorts of dehumanizations that such a context may make possible. Rather, it's a philosophical account of excessive violence and how that violence challenges our established philosophical concepts. A different book, one that I certainly did not write, would have a prescription component, one where strategies to enrich and impoverish moral ecology are outlined so that moral blameworthiness is easier to apply and responsibility is easier to pick out, where agents have an array of choices, including those choices that allow for individual flourishing and moral perfection. The second set of concerns is related to the first in that it belongs to a class of things that, according to Gomez, I am forgetting or neglecting or disregarding in my account. In general, these concerns have to do with the fact that the book is not spending enough time discussing the various victims, crimes, and even cartels associated with narco-culture, or the various writers, philosophers, or testimonies that have something to say about it. The suggestion here is that I am not being very inclusive of everything that narco-culture is about and everything that it implies. Gomez writes, Sanchez presents Mexico as one monolithic space that suffers equally, unquote, when in fact, she continues, the suffering is multi-layered, complex, and spread out. To this, I answer that I actually insist on the opposite. In talking about narco-culture, I make the case that there is no such thing as a monolithic, homogeneous Mexican culture. In exploring the meaning of culture in chapter 1, the intent is to show that narco-culture is one culture among many. Later on, Gomez says that I offer, quote, no specific distinction or analysis for border places like my hometown, Ciudad Juarez, Chihuahua, at one point considered the most dangerous city in the world and the main battleground for the Mexican war on drugs, even before the political events of 2006, unquote. My first instinct is to insist that the culture's geographical variations, the way that it is different from one place to another, will not show significant variations in brutality, dehumanization, nor reveal how narco-culture is not culture. To be sure, a focused analysis of the border region of El Paso and Juarez would certainly add nuances to my conception of brutality and the dehumanization of human bodies. However, the absence of such focus takes nothing away from the current analysis, as brutality is meant to be the excess of violence that is found everywhere, and not just in Mexico in general, or the border region in particular. Violence will be violence everywhere equally, just as brutality will be brutality everywhere equally. The differences that narco-culture highlights between brutality and violence is a difference that stands everywhere. A focus on one area where there is more or less violence or more or less brutality does not significantly contribute to this insight. Related to this, Gomez points out that, quote, I disregard the ramifications of narco-culture into the American immigration crisis, the maquiladora factory, hyper-exploitation of workers, etc. Again, to say that I disregard these is to assume that my project has anything to do with offering criminological or sociological analyses of the culture, and that I choose not to attend to immigrants, women, and border workers. However, this is not my project. The aim of the book, again, is to think about the meaning of personhood, culture, and violence. Ultimately, brutality applies to these phenomena as well. In fact, we now have the conceptual means to articulate the excessive violence against women, workers, and immigrants that goes beyond calling it horror, cruelty, or violence, terms that have been neutralized by overuse and moral apathy. Hence, we can now call it what it is. Worthwhile as it may be for philosophers, a criminal analysis of every possible brutal act is beyond the scope of the present book. The same can be said of every other specific detail that I may have disregarded or forgotten. The same can be said of Gomez's criticism that I somehow should have addressed, quote, the complex multi-dimensional layers of narco-violence, like extortions, kidnapping, sex trafficking, child pornography, and corruptions. These are not separate phenomena. All these injustices are intertwined. Sanchez seems to focus on the brutality against bodies and continuously mentions decapitations, but does not take into account the brutality of mind and spirit. There is brutality that cannot be quantified, unquote. The fact is that I didn't forget. It is just not necessary to address these other kinds of violence because the point is that, as Gomez puts it on my behalf, quote, these are not separate phenomena. Because as she puts it, and I repeatedly say in chapter 3, quote, brutality cannot be quantified. The third set of objections is a strange one. The tone could be described as one which says, leave Mexican concerns to Mexicans. It's strange to me because this is not asked of any of the dozen and even hundreds of US and European scholars and academics working on narco-culture outside of philosophy, sociologists, historians, ethnographers, etc. Gomez writes that as, quote, as philosophers, we need to define who gets to analyze Mexican culture and on what grounds, unquote. The suggestion here is that because we are philosophers, it is incumbent upon us to set boundaries for exclusion that dictate the criterion for who can analyze Mexican culture and on what grounds. How is this even remotely a job for philosophers? The suggestion that philosophers are somehow qualified to serve as gatekeepers regarding who can analyze Mexican culture, or any other culture for that matter, is a dangerously exclusionary one. Ultimately, this boils down to a dismissal of my intervention, of my concern, which because of my positionality, I am not qualified to pursue. It is a dismissal grounded on the fact that I myself am not situated at the border, that I'm in Northern California, that I'm not Mexican enough, or that I have no dog in the fight, that I have no personal stake in the game, as Gomez does. She continues, quote, "We need to defend Mexican philosophy and the importance of the positionality of philosophizing as a Mexican, and not just be content with philosophy about Mexicans," unquote. From who are we defending Mexican philosophy? Are we defending it from me? Or is the idea here that if we are to talk about Mexican problems, we should either leave it to the Mexicans or leave it for Mexican philosophy? But then can we use Mexican philosophy to talk about non-Mexican problems? I think this puts Mexican philosophy in a bind, one which I, in all of my writing on the subject, have always and will always absolutely reject. However, as a Mexican-American student of Mexican philosophy myself, how is this not Mexican philosophy? Whatever the case may be, the insinuation in this critique is that only a select group of people can talk about narco-culture, the victims, the activists, journalists, and Mexican philosophers. Again, this is a qualification that is not asked of historians, sociologists, or the various academics writing on these issues in the US and Europe. As far as I'm concerned, and despite its history, philosophers are not to involve themselves in gatekeeping of any kind. Earlier, Gomez objects that, quote, "there is no mention of philosophical figures like Ansaldúa, who could offer special insight into the complex hybrid dimensions of the in-betweenness of the border, and that instead I look at analyses from Aristotle, Jaspers, Hegel, Levinas, Foucault, Sartre, and etc." I'm not sure that the hybrid dimensions of the in-betweenness of the border have something, well, I'm sure that the hybrid dimensions of the in-betweenness of the border have something to do with brutality, with the absolute derealization of persons, or with the spectrum of violence I'm interrogating. And although I'm sure Ansaldúa or countless Mexican philosophers could help clarify what it is that I'm trying to understand, it is not necessary to do so, since again, our task is to try to make sense of violence and brutality. The intent here is to think about violence and how impoverished it is as a concept when thinking about real world crises. If I don't appeal to Ansaldúa, whom I don't know very well, or to Uranga, Portilla, or Zea, whom I do, it is not because I was trying to bury the philosophizing beneath Eurocentrism, but because the point was to philosophize about the phenomena and not give a platform to any one philosopher or any one tradition. If I am guilty of anything here, it is not using enough Fanon. The fourth set of objections has to do with the book's refusal to prescribe solutions. Gomez writes, quote, "Sanchez puts forward his own conceptual intervention that is mostly descriptive and that focuses on the existential complexity of narco-culture, but leaves one wanting more clues for normative prescriptions that would serve as potential solutions for the moral challenges and their brutal effects." Again, I leave out normative prescriptions because that's not the point. That is a different book, one that I definitely did not write. Nevertheless, Gomez asks, quote, "How will replacing a word over another going to solve this crisis of civilization? How is a conceptual intervention that asks us to use the word brutality instead of violence different than arguing that El Narco is better called organized crime, mafia, mob, drug lords, or sicarios, etc.?" Unquote. Now, this is an objection directed at all of us who apparently, and according to Gomez, waste our philosophical reflections asking what is questions, what is freedom, what is humanity, what is peace, what is violence. The object is that thinking about words and that to which they refer makes no significant difference to real world problems. In this case, Gomez asks about the point of distinguishing violence from brutality. My answer is the book. It's in the book itself, which seeks to show that violence as a concept, just like the concept of tolerance and peace and diversity and inclusion, has been neutralized and sensitized in our time by its uncritical overuse and repetition, as well as by the pervasiveness of violence in all of its different modalities. Reintroducing the concept of brutality into the violence narratives is meant to reinvigorate the conversation by pointing out phenomena that, unlike ordinary violence, cruelty, or terror, refuses to show itself in accordance with its logic. In this case, as in all others, conceptual analysis means to bring the differences to light. If I fail to do this here, then this book is a failure. But the worry is also that I leave the real problems untouched, that calling it brutality is not a strategy for overcoming the violence. It is a descriptive, not a normative reflection. I leave the normative, prescriptive, and broad political project to someone else. What's important to remember about the book is that I'm interrogating violence. Narco-Culture offers me a case study that allows me to analyze violence and its limits. That's the philosophical project. Brutality appears as a kind of violence that thrives in silence, and calling it out as the first step towards understanding it. Now, Gomez's criticisms are many. I choose these 4 sets only because clarifying them contributes to an understanding of the book. There are more in which she worries that I'm forgetting victims. Thus, she says that Sanchez forgets the thousands of victims of a narco that were model citizens or unsuspecting innocent bystanders that are never participated in illegal behavior, unquote. But what can we say about them? Can we perhaps say that the victims are victims of the erasures made possible by brutality? Can these victims perhaps be part of the unspeakable and unimaginable dead that I mentioned at the start of chapter 2? Yes, we can, and they are. I haven't forgotten the victims. It is simply not in the scope of the book to name them. Gomez says that I also, quote, ignore the misogyny of narco-culture. While I do agree that more could have been said about violence towards women in my book, my conclusions would be the same. Misogyny, in its most unspeakable forms, takes part in the logic of brutality. It seeks to hide itself in its objectifications. I'm also accused of making generalizations. Quote, Sanchez generalizes who the victims of narco violence are. He states that there is an overall lack of moral outrage because the victims are criminals, immigrants, jihadists, drug dealers, and so on. He claims that there are terrorists, kidnappers, Mexicans, narcos, unquote. To this I answer, the reason that we in America are not morally outraged is because the dead are thought to be the undesirables, the others, Mexicans, Africans, narcos, terrorists, immigrants. That is why there is no moral outrage. My point is a factual point about the prevailing attitudes and the reasons for them. As you put in the beginning, this book is meant for people here in the United States. That's the audience. If the narrative was different, if the dead were seen for what they are, average citizens, women, children, students, the elderly, then perhaps there would be moral outrage. But the fact is that there's not. Ultimately, if this book is able to turn our philosophical attention southward, then it is a success. I am aware, however, that a book that takes narco-culture as a starting point and seeks to make sense of its violence and death is sure to draw criticism, based simply on its ambition. Criticism, however, must consider what the book is not. The book is not an empirical study or a sociological or anthropological study into the cultural complex, which is narco-culture. This book is not an investigation into the different types of death or the different dead that this culture produces or which are produced in the culture. And finally, this book is not meant to be a historiographical in the sense that my aim is not to give an account of what has already been said about the violence of narco-culture. If this happens, it is merely marginal to what this book is. The book is a philosophical reflection on meaning, the meaning of culture, violence, brutality, and personhood, grounded in the phenomenon of narco-violence as a challenge to those concepts as traditionally understood. Finally, I don't think I've forgotten or ignored anything relevant to my analyses, at least not on purpose. What I've inadvertently forgotten, however, can perhaps become books unto themselves, and I encourage Gomez and others to write those books. Now that they know what must be remembered, not to write them would be an offense to their calling. Finally, I want to thank Sergio and Manuela for reading the book, for their time thinking about it, and for their heartfelt criticisms. It is a benefit to me, to which I am eternally grateful. Thank you.
Thank you. It's great. I feel like I'm just going to be agreeing with whoever talks last. It's been amazing. So here's what we're going to do. No pressure for Sergio or Manuela, but if I can put you, the two of you, in the front of the queue, but I'm going to start running a Q&A. Let me switch this back over to gallery for myself. Here we go. If you, some of you are familiar with this because you teach with this tool or do things, but in case you're not, if you look at the reactions, there's a raise hand feature, and I'll keep the queue going. But again, like I said, no pressure. But if Sergio and Manuela, I'll put the two of you up at the front. But if you don't have a question right now, so Sergio, you've got your hand up, so I'll let you go first. Manuela, when you have a question or comment, you'll go right to the top as well. That'll be the move. And I don't know what people's feelings are. I'm actually probably going to stop the recording now because I haven't been able to check with the 50 or so people that are here if they want to be recorded or not. So unless what do you guys, Manuela, Sergio, Carlos, what do you guys think? Maybe we record Sergio and Manuela's question. Because I don't want anyone to feel like they're if they're uncomfortable being recorded in their question.
Yeah, I think you should just stop the recording now. That way we don't have any issues.